Achtung, Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways 12 Days of Christmas Guests, where we're talking to a famous face about what the Second World War means to them. And today, we're continuing our series with the BBC newscaster, Sophie Raworth.
Achtung, Achtung, merrily on high. Welcome to our We Have Ways of Making You Talk 12 Days of Christmas specials.
Ding dong, merrily on Achtung.
Exactly. Achtung, the Herald Angels sing, and so on. But last year, the last couple of years, we've done readings for Christmas, but we thought we'd do something a bit different. We thought we'd talk to some special guests about the Second World War, inevitably, but where it fits possibly into their lives and interests. So, Jim, who have we got today?
Well, we've got a wonderful guest today. We've got Sophie Raworth, who needs very little introduction, but of course, she's one of the main faces of BBC News and an all-round good egg, and also an incredible runner, it has to be said. You've done some amazing things, haven't you, Sophie? You kind of, last time I saw you, you were racing a horse, I seem to remember, in Wales. And I think you won, didn't you?
Yeah, I wish. I know, that is a mad race. So basically, I love that because that started 30 years ago, and it was a pub landlord who said to the guy who ran the local hunt, "What do you think will be faster over 20 miles of the Brecon Beacons, a man or a horse?" And so they decided to race it. And now, 30 years later, 1,000 people go and do it every year. And they charge over the Brecon Beacons, and the horses go alongside you. And as the horses come up alongside you galloping, people start shouting, "Horse, horse!" And you have to duck out of the way into the bushes. And people, sometimes, I think like 3 people in the whole history, 3 people have ever beaten the horse. And they get quite a lot of money for doing it. And they did beat the horse last year. It was quite extraordinary. But I didn't.
Wow.
Wow. That sounds very sort of Regency, doesn't it? Betting on a man versus a horse. It's the sort of thing. It's the sort of thing you bet your stately home on and lose, isn't it?
But Sophie, there was another race I remember you doing back in 2015 when we were both over doing BBC stuff for the 70th anniversary of the Normandy D-Day landings, and you were covering the heads of state at Ouistreham. But then you had to read the 6 o'clock news at Arromanches.
Oh, that was mad.
And there was total French lockdown. And the only way you could get to Arromanches was by cycling. So you cycled from Ouistreham. And I remember at the time, I was completely gobsmacked by this. I couldn't believe that you could have got there and kind of arrived in Arromanches with minutes to spare and look so sort of fresh and ready to do the news. It was quite extraordinary. I
love that.
Impressed,
I've totally forgotten that. That was, and Ouistreham, do you remember that year? It was really delayed. It was like the whole service, the whole ceremony on the beach.
That's right.
Was very French.
Putin was there, wasn't he?
He was, wasn't he? Yes. And it was an hour delayed. And I thought, there were such tight roadblocks, and I had to get to Arromanches, which was where the BBC bulletins were going from, and it was the sort of first floor.
Well, there was that studio, wasn't there? They put that pop-up studio in
a cafe
on the roof of the Hotel de la Marine.
Yeah, it was in the first floor. It was just in the windows, an amazing view. And I said, "Well, I'll get there," and they went, "You won't be able to." And I went, "I will. I'll get a bike." So I hired a bike. And I cycled from really fast, as fast as I could. I pedalled out of Ouistreham to Arromanches, and about halfway through, I realised this was quite a long way. And I saw some Italians who were they were in like a World War II, like a Humvee or something, one of those extraordinary big vehicles. And I looked at them and I kind of waved, and I thought I could get my bike in the back there. And I looked at them and they sort of looked at me, and then they drove off. And I tried to say something to them, and I thought, no, this is ridiculous, keep cycling. And then they realised, I think, what I was going to say. And they actually pulled up. And I spoke very little Italian. I could just say my name, and I could say I am English. And I said I I am at the BBC. And they kind of, through sign language, we dumped my bike in the back of the huge vehicle, World War II vehicle, and they drove me to Arromanches.
It's amazing.
It was brilliant.
Just absolutely brilliant.
And then they dropped me. Oh, they dropped me at the bottom of a hill. Then we realised my bike had a puncture. I mean, this is all the 6 o'clock news coming up. My bike had a puncture. So, no, it didn't have a puncture. The chain came off. So the guy, the Italian, really sweet, got his hands completely filthy, and then put my chain back on for me. And then I got up the hill and I got on the 6 o'clock news. I had about half an hour to spare. But I did it.
It was amazing. But the key thing is you look completely unflustered.
That's what news is all about. It's always very last minute. And my job is to look unflustered. Yeah.
But that's 30 kilometres. That's a fair old distance to just say, yeah, I'll do that.
It's 18 miles or so, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was in a dress as well, from memory, I think. And I remember going, I must have looked completely ridiculous. I remember going across a zebra crossing too fast and somebody stepping out on it and shouting at me in French. And I was like, ooh, yeah, it was quite funny. I'd forgotten that.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't a day for Lycra, was it? Because you were in your glad rags for the presidents and prime ministers.
But I like a challenge.
Really
I remember thinking, I'm going to do this, I'm going to prove to them I can.
It was the most glorious day. It was an absolutely beautiful day, and I remember that in the evening the tide was out. So you'd finished your skit on the 6 o'clock news. The tide was long out, and Dan Snow was there, and
Sean Williams, I think, was there as well. There were a whole lot of us out there.
Sean Williams was there. Sean was there. Yes, absolutely. Anita Rani was there.
It was amazing.
And we all went out onto the beach, and there were loads of jeeps and ducks and other vehicles out on the beach. And I remember afterwards we were all kind of sort of ever so slightly demob happy. And I remember being out on the beach on this incredibly long beach at Arrowmarch, by all those sort of abandoned bits of concrete.
It's very eerie game. I've been there back there many times, and I always find it very. You do stand there, and particularly when you've got the veterans there, and who I think I went to my first D-Day commemoration in 1994. So they were all in their sort of 60s and 70s, and now you go back, and the last one I went to, and they're in their the youngest is now 95, and there was still last time I went, there was still a lot. There were a few hundred people there. But it's extraordinary to stand on those beaches, and you just imagine what these very old men remember. And it always strikes me how vivid their memories are. I'm always amazed by how there are moments of that time that they will never forget. And standing on those beaches, particularly for them, must bring it all back.
Well, I do remember that one we did a bio, the last one. I remember sort of hurtling in there, having to run across. So it wasn't quite as bad as you having to go from Bouchon, but I had to run across Bayer in a 3-piece wool suit. And it was incredibly hot again.
Oh, yes, that one. You were late. Yes, I remember that, yeah. It wasn't your fault.
Yeah, I was late because the ferry was late, the boat getting in was late, and then the ferry got stuck because of, yet again, the French roadblocks. But afterwards, I remember, it was all done and everything. We all went into the cemetery, and there was an old bloke there in his wheelchair, and he said, "Oh, I've just found my mate. And this guy had." He found the grave of this friend of his who'd been, obviously pretty young at the time, and he remembered exactly how this guy had died. And basically, they were being mortared and shelled, and this guy he was next to in his slit trench had just lost the plot, and suddenly jumped out of the slit trench and ran towards the Germans, who just cut him down. And he said, what did he say? He said he was 19 and I'm 99. I'm about to be 100. And there was just this pause where we all thought, this guy's had 80 years that other guy didn't have. And it was just it was an incredibly potent moment. It was very, very moving.
Now, Sophie, when we met, it was on that book programme. And I'd recommended Catch-22, which I assume you haven't read yet.
Yet is the important word.
You mentioned your grandfather and the work he did during the Second World War, which I think you've made a film about. Am I right in thinking that, or you've made a piece about?
I did a piece about it for the news. Yeah, we did a few years ago. We all did something about with People's War, and just about the different war efforts of people in our newsroom and their relatives. Because when you talk to people always have these amazing stories, don't you?
Yeah, and he was a surgeon. Am I right?
He was a surgeon. He was called Ernest Alexander Nicol, and he was a surgeon. He went to Cambridge Medical School, and then he went to St George's and trained in medicine. And he was a general surgeon at Mansfield General Hospital. And he basically he opened this place called he didn't go to war. I think he was late 30s. Yeah, he was late 30s during World War II. And so he very much stayed doing work on the home front. So he saw that, he was one of the early pioneers of rehab. So he was living in the Midlands, in the West Midlands and East Midlands, and it was full of collieries, and, coal was absolutely vital to the war effort. And he saw how many people, he was getting all these people coming into the hospital who were written off. There was nothing to, they had an injury in a mine, and that was it. The young men, and they had to stop working. And so he decided that he was going to, alongside the collieries, try and get people back to work. So he set up this thing called Berry Hill Hall, which was in Mansfield, and it was a sort of old stately home, and they took it over. And it was the first time that people had actually said, okay, you have broken your back or you have broken a limb, but we're going to actually get you back to work, because they needed people. They needed the miners, didn't they? They had to have that coal for the war effort. So they turned this home into, what you'd now it was a sort of rehab centre. People would go and live there, and they would get them. They had a gym, and they had, there's amazing footage where they have sort of pulleys with what looked like huge bags of flour on the bottom, and they'd have to exercise their legs. And what he worked on was the fact that, it wasn't just a broken bone, it was about building up the muscles that supported the bones. So he made these miners, do all this, really work hard. And it was the notion that at that time, that's not how people understood it. But he had this whole thing about how you have to do the work to get your body back in shape so that you can go back to work. And he was amazing. He transformed the lives of so many people who otherwise, in those days, in the late 30s, if you had an injury like that, if you smashed your leg or your knee or your shin or whatever, it was an amputation. That's how they fixed it. So he turned them around, and he ended up with, I think he had like 1,000 miners going through his centre every year, and most of them, like 90% of them, went back to work.
Wow. That's
incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was. And then, you sort of, it was very new. And so when he did it, it was the first one that they set up. And by the end of World War II, I think there were about 6 centres like that around the country. And they all realised the benefit of actually, you can't write people off. And before, people were just written off. If you got injured, that was it. And they put me, as part of that film, they put me down a mine in Yorkshire. I went down this mine, and it was just to give me an idea of what it was like. And, oh, my God, the conditions, and I knew the conditions were bad, but just the claustrophobia of being under there, and the noises and the creaking, and, the place I was in was a museum and very safe, but they were working, they were particularly, the Bevan boys later on when they were conscripted. And these were young men who thought that they were going to go to war, and suddenly were told, no, actually, you're going to go down the mines. And they had no experience whatsoever. And they're put into these really frightening situations, and where there were rock falls, and you could be injured at any moment. So no, he was extraordinary. I never really knew about it until after he died. That's the awful thing, isn't it? With your grandparents, I knew lots of what he did later in life, but I never really talked to him about that.
Gosh.
When you went down that mine, so it actually creaks, does it? You could hear even in the...
Yeah, I think it's more the sort of... that one is very well pinned up, but there was a huge lift, and it just takes you down into the bottom, and it's just tiny corridors, and going left, going right, and crawling under these spaces. And maybe in my head it creaked. I don't know. Well, it felt right. Quite scary.
They're staggeringly claustrophobic places, aren't they? They're horrible, and there is the feeling that hundreds of meters down, and the earth could sort of clear its throat, and you'd be squished, and no one would ever know. It's a very, very strange feeling. You must have been down. Have you been down a mine, Jim? Your parents, did they have down a mine when you were young? I don't know.
Well, they didn't actually know.
Up a chimney.
No, didn't have to do any of that. I have been down the Merkers mine, which is it in Thuringia or somewhere like that? It's where they found all the gold at the end of the Second World War, and it's a German mine, and it's absolutely vast. And they've actually got vehicles. You're a kilometre down or whatever, and you go down in these lifts, and down on there's these huge sort of. It's very low ceiling, but they're quite wide, so they're wide enough for a truck to go across. So you get into these kind of sort of weird, really sort of low level trucks, and you beetle around this mine. And it just goes on and on and on and on, and it's really warm, and incredibly claustrophobic, but obviously not claustrophobic in the same way as going down pit, because what you were saying is it's incredibly narrow mines and all the rest of it, and shafts and little corridors and all the rest of it. This was huge, but it's a deeply unsettling thing. You're very happy when you're out of there.
I hadn't realised when I made that film. I went and met a Bevan boy who was in his 90s. And that I found fascinating because obviously there were so many of them, like 50,000, weren't there, who were conscripted. And it was so random that it was such a lottery as to whether or not you were going to be sent down the mine. It was Bevan, the War Office, or the Employment Office, they just chose a number, and that batch with that, I think it was every fortnight, and they randomly chose a number, and that 10% of men were sent down the mine rather than going to war. And for the Bevan boys, the way this guy talked to me about it was how, he wasn't able to fight for his country, that they wanted, everybody else was going off everybody else got a uniform and went off to fight for their country. And he was sent down the mine. He had to buy his own helmet and he had to buy his own boots, he said. And got no recognition for it until so many, decades later, wasn't it? It was in the 90s they finally got the recognition for it. And that whole sort of stigma surrounding it, where people thought that some of the miners were sort of accused of being not deserters, but not putting their effort, not going to the war, not going to the front, when in fact they had no choice.
Yeah, they were seen as conchies, weren't they? Eric Morecambe was a Bevan boy.
No, I didn't know that. Wow.
I never knew that. Yeah, it must have been really hard, mustn't it?
Yeah.
Because also the other thing is, if you're going down the pit every day, that's not exactly like they're letting you off the license, the death sentence that you might be if you're in a tank, because it's also incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're still putting your life on the line without the kudos.
Yep.
Really tough. And you've got no recourse, have you? So you can't just go, no, I don't want to do this. I want to go and be a gunner.
No, they were sent to prison, weren't they? They were sent to prison. They had to do it, and if you didn't do it, you'd be sent to prison. When the war ended, they were still conscripted, weren't they? I think it was the last ones were let out in 1948, I think. So it was a long time after the war ended.
That's terrible.
That the miners were finally allowed to stop working in the mines.
Yeah. And every now and again, someone from a posh school would end up working in a mine as well. They did have that, because they were conscripted. You'd get the odd person who'd suddenly find themselves in a working class environment they never imagined they'd ever find themselves in. I'm not sure any actual old Etonians ended up mining, but people who'd really expected to become officers ended up mining, which I think is amazing. The sort of jumble of the whole thing.
Mm. Well, apparently some of them were, it was so random that the people had been training. They'd been training to go to war, and they would literally from one day to the next be told, actually, you're going down the mines. You're staying here. You're not going abroad. You're staying here, and you're going to go and get coal. It was that random.
It is interesting, though, that the idea that you would rehabilitate your workers and patch them back together, and that was a good thing. Is the idea that it's quite new is a little shocking, isn't it, or revealing in terms of social attitudes, that if someone had a fall in the mine, well, that's their tough luck, isn't it? Yeah,
there was something about I think my grandfather wrote some paper about it, and this is the late 1930s, I think 1939, and it was the notion that you actually there was a sort of passive nature of the doctor, and that the emphasis was on you to do the exercise. You had to work really hard, which is very modern now. If I get a running injury now, I know I have to do the rehab. The doctor's not going to be able to sort it out for me. Well, they can tell me what it is and what I need to do, but I have to do it myself. And they had these in the grounds. They do sport, and they do. My mum remembers going there as a child and just watching, seeing them doing sport and games and throwing balls around, and just about getting the body moving again. And then they'd be put to work in the laundry, or it was just about making the body move and getting over the injury. And people had these awful injuries. There was a film that was made with my grandpa, with this guy in a sort of, he looks like if you can imagine being in a hammock, but you're actually facing down, you're on your stomach. So you're kind of in a hammock shape, but with your stomach and your head up and your legs, your feet coming up at the end. And he's being bandaged up into sort of a cast. So he's been set in cast from his shoulders all the way down to his waist or beyond. And they treat them like that. And then they'd sort of, get them out of that and then get them into sort of physical rehab. Amazing, absolutely incredible to see. I wish I'd talked to him about it more. He talked more about, he became an orthopaedic surgeon, so he was one of the first in the NHS, and he spent the rest of his career in the NHS as a surgeon, but I never ever spoke to him about that place. And when I went back, it was really eerie walking. It's now been turned into flats, but Just
I bet it was
very funny walking around thinking my grandfather, opened this and walked, this is where he would have been striding the corridors. And it's quite extraordinary thinking he did that.
And have you got any other sort of Second World War heritage in your family? Because I don't really have any. I'm rather envious of Al, because he had a grandfather who was a hero in 1940, and another grandfather who was doing amazing diplomatic things in Greece at the end of the war, and all sorts. And both mine were they were auxiliary firemen, one in Birmingham, one in London, but no one who was actually sort of actively serving or anything.
No, mine. It makes me sound really old, but my other grandfather was World War One.
Yeah, same with me.
I can never quite get my head around. So he was World War One. He was a pilot in the RAF, and
very good.
Wow.
Well, he wasn't even RAF. He was Royal Flying Corps.
Yeah.
So at the age of 17, he joined the Royal Flying Corps. And he was flying those. I mean, he was flying de Havillands, which are like flying wooden aircraft with linen wings, and flying those over France, which I find extraordinary because my daughter's just about to turn 17. And I cannot imagine. She's a child, she's still a child, and the notion of them going to war at that age. And when you see all the way, you and I, we've all seen the veterans on a D-Day and how young they were when they went to war. And I look at my own children, my daughter's one of them is 18, one's about to be 17. I can't imagine them doing that, going off to war or going to do anything like that. Incredible.
Yes, it is.
They're just not old enough. They're just not old enough to do that kind of thing.
And yet they did.
No, I think it's interesting though. Well, and it's interesting, when one looks at sort of diaries and things, you start to see that a lot of these young men, they are still, they're boy men. They're not fully grown up. They might be old enough to go to war and command a tank or whatever. But they're definitely not kind of fully formed and fully grown up by any stretch of the imagination. You can see it in the language of the letters and diaries and stuff.
Well, which is maybe what the whole thing relies on in the end, is young people. I'd be saying, come off it. I'm not doing that. I'm old. Yeah. I'm old. I've got a mortgage.
Forget it.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. They had it was for them. It was the excitement, wasn't it? It was the thrill. It was going abroad. It was. For my World War One grandfather, it was flying. I mean, can you imagine getting? I'd done quite a lot of stuff in military aircraft in the last sort of 10 years, which is ridiculous because I really don't like flying very much. Although they've cured me, but I did. They put me up in a de Havilland, and I just thought, how could you? That was less than 10 years after the first manned flight. And those young men going up in the skies and not just only flying, but fighting each other.
Yeah.
Unbelievable what they then did. Yeah. But then I suppose it was also that it was that or the trenches, wasn't it?
Exactly. Oh, well, thank you, Sophie, for chatting with us. Is there apart from is there anywhere where your grandfather's work is sort of, commemorated or logged? If you wanted to learn about this history, where would you do it?
There was a website for Berry Hill Hall in Mansfield. There's quite a lot written about that.
Yeah.
And then, and there is something called the Nichols Plate. He was called Ernest Nichol. The Nichols Plate, which you won't be able to see because it's in people's knees. But
oh wow! So he got a medical device named after him.
He's got the Nichols Plate, which is some sort of metal thing they put in knees because obviously the miners have to crawl around, and it was all about what they put into the knee to allow the miners to get back to work. So
that's surely the thing all doctors aspire to, is a medical application named after them. I mean, that's the Hall of Greats. That's fantastic.
That's very good, isn't it?
It was amazing after I did that piece on the news a few years ago, and the number of emails I got from people saying, I remember your grandfather, he treated my father, he saved my father, he did this, he did that. And the number, it quite clearly had a profound impact on a lot of people's lives.
Well, you must be rather proud.
I was really proud. I couldn't believe what he'd done, but But it was incredible that all these people remembered him, and it had obviously turned people's lives around, which is what the whole point was of the rehabilitation, getting them back to work.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for talking to us.
Lovely to talk to you.
Have a wonderful Christmas.
I will, and you enjoy it.
Thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.
Bye.